most likely next use of a nuclear weapon by human beings against each other is probably India, Pakistan. So yeah, we should all probably know a little bit more about it.
Hello and welcome to the More Freedom Foundation podcast. I am Murray, in charge of podcasting, and in charge of politics is Robert Morse. How are you this time?
Not bad, not bad. How you doing, Murray?
I thought you'd be in good form. You kept saying people from America called Rob should have more power around the world.
Oh yeah, is that something that I say?
Yeah, you say it all the time. It's your catchphrase. Just the new Pope.
Oh yeah, that's true. Robert Prevost, or what have you. Papa Bob. Papa Americano. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I don't have like deep thoughts about that, but it is an interesting.
They just kept saying he was like the most un-American American. That seemed to be their defense for picking an American.
Oh, I think there's, isn't there footage of him at White Sox games or something along those lines? I know he's got that most American of traditions, which is a embarrassing brother who didn't do much and is willing to give embarrassing interviews about him.
Okay, I thought is he not just excited that his brother's the Pope?
No, I think he's a MAGA brother. I think the Pope has a MAGA brother who's sort of going on TV and talking about it. Generally speaking, if you're like the brother of somebody powerful and you're going on television to talk about that, probably not a good thing for the person in power. I can't really think of a great. Well, I guess the Kennedy brothers are well regarded, or maybe that's just because both of them got assassinated. And
wow,
the siblings of people in power should be both far from power and quiet. I think is my preferred approach.
But judging by the last episode, you're the MAGA brother.
I'm the MAGA brother. Oh, because I'm willing to speak up for Donald Trump's efforts in Yemen and Syria. You never know. You never know what's going to happen. I try to make my judgments based on what I see, and there's obviously nothing in Donald Trump's domestic policy that I find at all attractive. But the fact that he seems to be stopping Middle East wars, I kind of like. I wonder if the new Pope. For me, the popes are most valuable in that they are traditionally very pro-peace, and I from what little
that means
I've seen,
they're woke. We need a war Pope.
Well, honestly, if Donald Trump has done more to bring peace to the Middle East in 4 months than Joe Biden ever did, does that make Donald Trump more woke than Joe Biden?
Possibly, as long as they don't have an English Pope. They were pretty bad for Ireland.
Oh yeah, really? When was the English Pope?
A long time. Was it Pope Adrian? I think there was like a crusade against Ireland, so that was pretty bad.
Oh, is this like medieval times?
Very long time ago.
Okay, yeah, I'm not too familiar with that. Sure, because Ireland was Christian before everybody else.
Yeah, but then I think because it was like Christian it was sort of became slightly different Christian.
Well, that's the thing,
was like
because
good enough excuse.
Because it was so early, it had become Christian before the Pope had successfully imposed his will over all of Northern Europe. So there was a clash when that was being imposed, and there were a lot of distinctive Irish Christian traditions that were crushed by Roman Catholicism.
Do you want to talk about a place that has some more conflicts because of what Britain got up to?
100%, and actually bringing up that conflict between the Pope. So I want to delve deep. I already did a live chat on India and Pakistan's conflict. So what I think is going to make this particular piece of content different is I kind of want to dive deep into the conflict between India and Pakistan. And yes, you've put your finger right on it, Rory, as you so often do. The British are at the heart of that problem. However, the disputes, as Indian and Pakistani nationalists will both be very happy to tell you, those disputes do go back before the British. And I think so it's worth just sort of discussing the whole thing. I am someone who is very presentist in his orientation, I suppose. Not so much, what's happening this decade, but I don't have a lot of respect for historical explanations that go back
too long ago,
before industrialization. I mean, industrialization is the big bar for me. Like if before we were living in an industrial, mostly literate world, you've got some explanation for a current conflict. I think you may very well believe it, but I don't think you've really got a firm connection to what's going on. I think the ancientness of Hindus and Muslims and a bewildering variety of other faiths living together on the Indian subcontinent is, I mean, it's so deeply, deeply seated. And this idea, which I see as a very European idea, that you can have antagonistic nation states based on some kind of true national idea that's linked to these religions in this way, is just it's been a pretty failed and ugly effort. And I think where we've seen this failed and ugly effort sort of manifest itself with the horrible terrorist attack on April 22nd, and the infinitely more horrible fact that the first and is it fourth or fifth most populous countries on the planet, both of which nuclear powers, spent 4 days falling into what looked a lot like open warfare in May of this year. So I do want to go into the deeper historical roots, but of course, the reason we've finally been persuaded to talk about India and Pakistan is that between May 7th and May 10th, they fell into what I think is largely conceded to be the most open and indiscriminate warfare that they've been engaged with since the 1970s. So for over 50 years, a problem that had been dealt with on a much more civilized plane for quite some time
Got quite hot.
terrifyingly close to a sort of total war sort of aspect. Not to say there weren't incidents, and that's, I think, in part why it is so disturbing. There have been plenty of incidents. They talk about the Kargil War in 1999. There were certainly much worse terrorist attacks than the one that India used to justify falling into this level of conflict. 2008.
Mumbai.
Yep, that would be the worst of them. As recently as February 2019, there was a serious attack that did, I think, spark an Indian attack on aspects of Pakistan, but nowhere near as deep and frightening as what we saw in those May days. So hopefully this is going to go up probably towards the end of May. And my hope, not 100% on this, but I think it's likely that the ceasefire that was established on May 10th will persist. But it's entirely possible that it hasn't. And frankly, it's entirely possible that we'll be talking about the first nuclear war since World War II, and the first one where there was reciprocal exchanges.
Yeah, both sides had.
I deeply hope that that's not the case, and I think
it's all simmered down, and people have nearly forgotten about it.
But because this is going to be coming out a week or two from now, we're going to be going historical. We're going to be going deep. So there has been, Rory, Muslim presence in the Indian subcontinent since at least the 800s.
So fairly recently, then.
Yeah, it's last week. So I'm not gonna. So my level of sympathy for Modi, or more extreme versions of Modi that imagine that, India more broadly can somehow be made free of this Islamic influence, or that is somehow a better, something to strive for, I have zero sympathy for. These religions, these communities, these folkways, these societies have been not intertwined. They've been the same thing for at least 1,000 years here. And I see the innovation, I think the savage barbarity that should be fended against is this very European idea that these religions can be divvied up into discrete units. That is something that they've been trying to do for way too long. But as for the history, so in the 800s, it was I think it might have actually been Arab invasions in the 800s. I could be wrong about that. Extraordinary how far the Arabs got in those first 100 years or a couple hundred years after Muhammad. And then since then, they've kind of been co-opted by Persians and Turks, like most of the Islamic civilizations since those first 200 to 400 years. Have been ruled by populations that are not Arab, but I do think there might have actually been some Arab invaders that made it all the way to territories that can be described as India. And then in the thousands, a big figure is Mahmud of Ghazni, who pushed things in significantly further. By the 1200s, the Delhi Sultanate, Delhi, New Delhi, these are sort of the capitals of India at this point. A lot of the power structures of modern India, certainly in the north anyway, the Muslims' penetration was much less. The further south you go, the less Muslim history there is in India. But, the capital was established. I mean, India, the Taj Mahal is one of the great symbols of India, and it is very much an Islamic structure, but a very different version of Islam. And I think that's important to recognize. And one of the reasons why I get so, I just find it incomprehensible that people want to talk about like religious conflicts that are 1,000 years old. Like what Hinduism is today is entirely distinct from what it was 50 years ago, is on a completely different planet from what it was 1,000 years ago. And I think that's a less controversial statement than saying Islam of 50 years ago is a completely different thing from what it is today and is on a completely different planet from what it was 1,000 years ago. The context in which it operates, it's all of this stuff is constantly mutable and changing. And I think I would submit that both India and Pakistan and the British overlords before them pushed these religions, these societies, these folkways into more antagonistic directions that they did not need to go into. But of course, there were very much, and you will have Indian nationalists who will describe this 1,000-year process. Really, I think with the Delhi Sultanate in the 1200s, the Muslims got pretty far, and then it was pushed to their final extent by the Mughal Empire between the 1500s and the 1700s. There are a lot of Indian nationalists who will describe this as a genocide. This, by basically totting up all of the military altercations, massacres, horrible things that have happened over 1,000 years. And this is to be seen as a distinct atrocity that Muslims have committed against Indians. And I think that's just transparent nonsense, to sort of boil down 1,000 years of historical processes into this. So by the time the British got there, the subcontinent of India, the territory, was the most powerful figure was the Mughal emperor, who in the 1600s was still powerful enough to absolutely crush an attempted British invasion.
Wasn't it a sort of classic divide and conquer Britain ended up doing?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. There is something that bothers me that I think, just to give a sop to the Indian nationalists, I was thinking a lot about this. If we're talking about Indian history, there's a lot of snide, frankly, a little bit white supremacist people who are like, well, India wouldn't even be unified if it weren't for the British. Like, India was never a country before the British. And I think that is such hogwash. That is nonsense. First off, India was never unified under the British. They maintained British India in a wide variety.
Yeah, it was quite a patchwork.
Yeah, there's a prince here and a Nawab there, and sure,
and a company here.
Yeah, exactly. It was a mismatch. That's one point. But also, like, nothing was unified before the 19th century. Like, this idea that there was a unified Chinese empire or nation state in a way that we would recognize it before, like, the 1900s, or really honestly before the Chinese Communist Party, is kind of nonsense. The idea that there was a unified France in the way that we're talking about it before the 1900s is nonsense. So I think it's more than a little ignorant for people to be like, oh, the British unified India. Like, A, they didn't. B, the extent to which there was political unification going on in the 19th century wasn't about the British. It was about the possibilities of political unification that became more present. Like, if it's not, I think they say that like Italian became like the majority language of Italy at some point in like the 1930s.
Oh yeah, because there were so many different ones all about.
And it didn't really happen until like the 1950s. In France, maybe it was a century earlier where all the dialects got sort of unified or what have you. So this idea that like India only exists because the British put it together is, I think, deeply historically ignorant. So
the Mughal Empire is most of today's India.
Well, except for, I think it's the Deccan. They keep sort of where is the Deccan Plateau? But certainly most of the tip, I don't think the Mughals ever quite made it down there.
But definitely a large chunk of modern day India was under the Mughal Empire.
Certainly, though, Indian nationalists would dispute that vociferously. Because Indian nationalists want to overemphasize the powers of the Hindu potentate. So this was always a weird mismatch. The Mughal Empire died because actually, in kind of a modern twist, they had a incredibly powerful, incredibly fanatically Islamic emperor, as his emperor, yeah, named Aurangzeb. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, and I apologize. He was in charge for 50 years. He spent most of those 50 years warring his way down the Indian subcontinent, and his fanaticism did give him some real power and allowed him. But after him, like he basically he expanded and killed the Mughal Empire because the reaction against that was so strong. But before him, like I think the Mughal emperor who built the Taj Mahal, were some of them were like completely off the wall, like kind of forming their own like mix between Hinduism and Islam, like,
Okay.
and there was a lot of like, this is just what I'm talking about. Like what Islam it was 50 years ago is completely different from today. What it was 1,000 years ago is a completely different planet.
But wouldn't you consider this region to be like one of the hubs of civilization throughout a lot of Earth or world history? A bit like how
100%.
China is also treated?
100%. And the religions of Southeast Asia, China, Vietnam, they're all worshiping an Indian guy.
And don't a lot of our concept of numbers come from India?
Quite possibly. The details, I'm not sure about the details on that one. But the Buddha is an Indian figure. I spent some time in Southeast Asia last year, and it was fascinating, just like going through all of just that connection between, in Vietnam, a little more Chinese, but it was mostly Indian influence that was sort of dominating Southeast Asia, which I hadn't really been fully aware of. So yeah, tremendously powerful place, clash and intervening and mixture between Islam and Hinduism that has been going on for 1,000 years. The imposition of more European ideas of stricter lines between Hinduism and Islam are absolutely a British introduction. The British had, set up separate universities, separate religiously based centers of learning. Part of this was largely innocent, just sort of applying the same sorts of categories that they had applied to their own religions and their own much longer standing interactions with Islam in Europe. But a lot of it was exactly what you were talking about. A lot of it was divide and conquer. Now, Indian nationalists and Pakistani nationalists, I think each have very detailed stories about how the British were partial to and gave more power to the Hindus, or on the other hand, that they gave it to the Muslims. And both Hindu and Pakistani nationalists are actually right. They're both entirely correct about this, because British India was a going concern from like the 1750s until the 1940s. So you're talking about most of 200 years there. So, and over those periods of times, things would happen. The most obvious inflection point would be the 1857 First War of Indian Independence. In that first century, I think the British were a little more partial to the Muslims with their what they saw as a more developed martial tradition. The Muslims were invaders just as the British were invaders, had that tradition, in a lot of India. The Muslims, a lot of the India that Britain found, the Muslims were sort of on top and, were the more aristocratic folks that perhaps the British felt that they could interact with. But in 1857, these predominantly Muslim military forces rebelled against the British. So the British sort of switched their focus. And then in the early 20th century, in the run-up to independence, as the more numerous Hindus began to exert themselves, sort of personified in the figures of Gandhi or Nehru, the Nehru family. Then, of course, they started leaning a little more towards the Muslims because the Muslims were weaker, so they wanted to make them more powerful. And I mean, that is, and that sort of oscillation means that both Indian and Pakistani nationalists are correct when they say that there were periods of time where the British favored one over the other.
Just whichever would help Britain the most.
Yes. And a key aspect of this 1,000-year history is that I think it's an oversimplification, but I think a lot of these Muslim invaders were a little more interested in like the northern parts of the country, going, across that and beyond that. There were more natural communication across that. I mean, it's a Jared Diamond thing. It's easier to go. It's easier to export civilizations
left, right, than up and down.
Exactly. So there's more Muslim influence in the north, but that's also where most of the population is. And the British in some cases exacerbated this, in some places ameliorated it, what have you. It's a patchwork. And there was a lot more economic activity going on in Bengal. So the Muslims who kind of had the upper hand for a number of centuries there were more likely to spend more time focused on Bengal, modern-day Bangladesh, and the modern Indian state of West Bengal, I think they call it, where Calcutta, the traditional capital of that region, is. So there was just a much higher Muslim presence where you'd expect it to be in sort of the northwest of the country, which was closer to the Middle East, closer to where the Islam was coming from. But then also in the northeast, you had a huge concentration. Bangladesh today is a strongly Muslim country with serious minorities of many religions.
What used to be East Pakistan?
Exactly. So that, like, perhaps counterintuitively, it's those are sort of the main concentrations. And as the British control of India was falling apart, those were the regions that wanted their own Muslim state. Of course, as becomes very, very apparent in the 1970s, what we're talking about here, as is inevitable with everything with India and Pakistan, which is why I don't like to talk about it so much, is that we are dramatically oversimplifying things.
Oh, definitely.
Within Hinduism, of course, part of the program of Modi and people like him is ironing out some of the extraordinarily vast diversity of Hindu practice. But there's Hindu practice, and then there's Buddhists, and there's Jains, and there's like so many other things.
Well, considering you have well over 1 billion people, there is going to be a lot of nuances within that.
Yes. And there's tremendous nuance within the practice of Islam. What's kind of interesting is before Saudi Arabia was the home of Islamic fundamentalism, India sort of had strains of Islamic fundamentalism, but they also had a whole bunch of other strains and strains of Sufism. And so all of this is more diverse and more complex than we are describing here. One of the very key cleavages is that the Pakistanis, I suppose now the modern Pakistanis who follow Islam, are very different from the Bengals that follow Islam. And this became, it is, I believe, to some extent an ethnic difference, a historic difference, this, that, the other thing, which created real problems for Pakistan. So I think the British spent a lot of time fostering these differences between Muslim and Hindu. But by the final decades, they were like, oh God, what have we done? And were less happy about what I think they could see the horrible situation that they had set up there. Pakistan was very interested in getting as much territory as it could. I think it's fair to say that they failed to get as much territory as they wanted. The famous example would, of course, be Kashmir, which had a Muslim majority, but had a Hindu potentate in charge, and is also tremendously strategically important. And in the First War, so partition, I think the British scuttled away in August of 1947. Modern states of India and Pakistan came into being, and this instantly produced a horrific situation.
Wasn't there a thing where it was like you have like a week to get to this new territory or you're trapped?
Well, it's actually it is very similar to something that was happening at the same time, the Nakba in Israel-Palestine, obviously much tinier scale Israel-Palestine, because India today has I think India today is technically like the third or fourth largest Muslim country.
It nearly has more Muslims than Pakistan, which is hard to believe. 200 million, but which is 14% of its population, making it the third most populous Muslim country.
Yeah, it's just extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. So it would entirely depend. I think actually Gandhi was famously, maybe it wasn't partition, maybe it was a different historical instance, but famously kept Calcutta reasonably peaceful just through his personal weight, or perhaps that was during a different episode of intercommunal violence. But so it would depend, if you were in a village where you were surrounded by Hindu villages, you're like, well, maybe we should F off to Pakistan. But if you were an urban population that felt secure, then you would stay.
But it's something that's like massively overlooked, I think, in history. 15 million people displaced and over 1 million killed.
Yeah, in the space of a few weeks and months. It's truly horrific. If you want to, there's certainly plenty of pop cultural representations of this. Just really horrific. Trains full of refugees getting slaughtered, and then the train goes through anyway, and so. And this was going in both directions. Just the fact that 1 million people were killed to set up this I see as a very European idea of distinct nations for each religious group is horrifying. That was in August, and by October, India and Pakistan had fallen into their first full-on war. This is the first of 3 full-on wars that India and Pakistan have fought since independence in 1947. My understanding is it was sort of started off in October 1947 and was largely resolved by January of 1949 in a ceasefire. And the matter in this conflict was Kashmir, as was, I think, with the sole exception of 1971, the issue was almost always Kashmir.
Pakistan invades Kashmir at this point because is it seen as mostly Muslim, but it's a place that India has taken as theirs?
Yes. And I think the line of control, was that initially established probably in 1947, this first war. So there is Pakistani-administered Kashmir, there is Indian-administered Kashmir, and there might even be some other more complicated territories that I did not get into the details of. Every conflict except for 1971 seems to be some variety of the Pakistanis trying to get back Kashmir. It seems to be how most of these things start, and most of these things start with Pakistan losing, which is why the Pakistani public seems to be so exultant over what just happened this May, because the ceasefire seems to have caught the conflict at a good time for Pakistan, so that there is a story that can be told that this time around was kind of a Pakistani victory, though I think on any real sense it's
definitely
just not
something
the
that
case.
probably might scare India, so they massively invest in their air force. So
Which
it could have a bad effect on Pakistan in the long term.
Well, exactly, because it's what sort of kept coming to mind is, hey, Rory, do you like the More Freedom Foundation?
I do.
Would you like us to keep being able to do the More Freedom Foundation?
That's something I think is a wonderful idea. Could you please tell me more?
The way to do that would be to sign up for Patreon. Patreon is a crowdfunding service, kind of like Kickstarter, except it allows you to send us a certain amount of money every month.
Are there any benefits I get if I sign up to Patreon?
There is a Discord server, which is just for Patreon members. Folks love it over there. We got a lot of really smart folks talking about the news of the day. I find it really useful for my research sometimes. So we've got that Discord server, and we've got not 1, but 2 patrons-only events every month. We've got the patrons-only newscast, where patrons suggest stuff that I should look into, and I provide sort of a capsule update for the month. And then we have, on the Discord server, we have a chat with me and the patrons.
So if you have ever wanted to be in my position, asking Rob questions, then there's your chance.
There you go. Yeah.
So that is available only to people who sign up on Patreon. I hope you'll join us there.
What comes to mind, which is a terrifying parallel, is actually Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia, because it had, in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union, Armenia and Azerbaijan went to war in the 1990s. At that point, because the Armenian diaspora is present in a lot of wealthy countries, the Armenians had a lot more outside support and were able to beat Azerbaijan very badly and occupy and ethnically cleanse large swaths of Azeri territory. Pakistan, the fact that Pakistan, even today, the fact that Pakistan has been able to go toe-to-toe to some degree, though they lose every time, with India since 1947 has entirely been an artifact of outside sponsorship. The United States for decades, and now the United States and China. And what happened to Armenia is eventually the fact that Azerbaijan is a tremendously well-endowed petrostate. And the tragedy of Armenia is that so eventually Azerbaijan was able to build up the military and the material they needed to absolutely crush Armenia.
Mm-hmm. And Russia was busy.
Yes, and Russia was busy, famously. This, I believe, was in 2020, a war sort of established at this, and then the sort of coup de grace in early 2023 when Nagorno-Karabakh was essentially without too much bloodshed, but was completely ethnically cleansed, which I think the UN definition would call genocide. But the great tragedy was in that period from the 1990s up until 2020 it was obvious to everybody except for the Armenians that Azerbaijan was getting dramatically more powerful than them. And the Armenian nationalist ideal maintained that, oh, no, we beat the Azeris in the 1990s, we're going to beat them forever, this, that, and the other thing. And in 2020, in a rather brief war, the Azeris cleaned their clocks, took back all of their traditional territory, and then emptied out the Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan that had been the bone of contention for a century. And I fear that Pakistan is getting exactly that kind of 1990s Armenian buzz. They're like, oh, yeah, look at us. We did the right thing. Our planes are like a little bit better, or, we've sacrificed most economic development and the possibility of democracy to beefing up our military with the support of U.S. and China. And we kind of semi-won an engagement.
Because I think in one area Pakistan can't go toe-to-toe with India is in the air.
Mm-hmm.
Because India has to defend itself from China, it means then Pakistan can just focus all its cards on India.
Mm-hmm.
And it does seem to have these, is it J-10C fighters everyone's talking about from China?
Mm-hmm.
It has some very sophisticated stuff and a lot of okay things. So in that one area, it can, challenge India.
Well, that way, that may very well be the case, but that's incredibly tenuous. And at the end of the day, India is a place with a flourishing economy and 1.4 billion people.
Mm-hmm.
So the parallels between Azerbaijan and India are pretty clear here, and the parallels between Pakistan
It's just getting dwarfed.
and Armenia should be clearer.
Because I think there was a time their Pakistan's GDP was bigger, and, India just dwarfs it now.
Yeah. And the fact is that Pakistan has always been losing this. I think that Jinnah and the other founding folks of Pakistan believed firmly, and they were right, that Kashmir was essential to having a minimally viable Pakistani state. They did not get Kashmir. By January 1949, a ceasefire was established, and my understanding is that the control of Kashmir has not significantly changed since. What has changed significantly since is there used to be an East and a West Pakistan, because they managed to get both of these traditional Muslim territories under one government. They were not contiguous. They had India in the middle.
A very ugly way of doing a country. I tend to think somewhere like Poland, where it's close to a blob.
Exactly.
Is perfect. But when you have little enclaves and bits and somewhere on the other side of a subcontinent, it's very tricky.
Yes, it's very tricky, and that trickiness was exacerbated by the fact that the Pakistanis of West Pakistan looked down on the predominantly Bengal population.
Because the other thing isn't Pakistan an acronym of all the regions, but it's only the regions of West Pakistan, but not any of the ones in East Pakistan, for instance.
Yeah, and apparently they were more or less occupied by West Pakistan. Up until 1971, we've got what I think is called the Bengal genocide, where the Pakistan is generally judged to have killed somewhere between 300,000 and 3 million Bengalis.
Wow.
3 million seems incredibly high, but Bangladesh is a very large country. So that went on for about 8 months. My understanding, I'm not too familiar with this. There's a great book called The Blood Telegram that I've always meant to read on this, but my understanding is that this is one of the nastier things that is hung on Kissinger and Nixon, because at this point, Pakistan was very much a very strong U.S. Cold War ally. India was very much not, and we heavily armed and supported and provided diplomatic cover for this genocide, apparently, that Pakistan was committing in Bangladesh. Apparently, the 1971 war was 1 week long, because presumably Pakistan's resources were quite tapped at this point, and India was able to just, I assume, move its forces into Bangladesh.
And they also captured a staggering amount of soldiers. I have here 90,000 Pakistani soldiers were captured.
Wow. Yeah. And that was a tremendously costly conflict for Pakistan. There's an interesting dynamic between, and this is a larger discussion about nuclear weapons and whether nuclear weapons are a good thing or a bad thing. Looking at these conflicts, 1947, 1949, the parallels between, it's not the last parallel between Israel-Palestine and the war that was fought in 1948 to establish Israel. They did fight that a bunch against a bunch of Arab countries, but these were Arab countries that were just directly post-independence, didn't have a lot of capacity. And I think you can probably make a case that that's similarly the case in 1947 through 1949 in India. I think at that point, both the Indian and Pakistani militaries still had a lot of British people in their hierarchies, is
definitely.
my understanding. And perhaps they were acting to, how were they acting? What forces were being used in this war? And it is interesting because there was a war we have not mentioned in 1965. It does appear like the 1947 is sort of this scrappy thing at the beginning where
The Second Indian-Pakistani War.
well, the second Indian is in 1965. So
Yeah.
the scrappy earlier one, like nothing's really established. We're scrambling. There's a partition. There's mass murder. It's chaotic. There aren't 1965. It strikes me as like, okay, we've been established countries with military procurement. Presumably most of the British people are no longer running our militaries by 1965. And just the scale, I think I read on Wikipedia, so, take it with a grain of salt, that it was like the largest tank battle since World War II or something. So it's a tremendous step up. 1971 is another huge step up in the numbers of planes that are shot down, the numbers of, I don't know if necessarily the numbers of tanks that are destroyed, but certainly in the casualties that Pakistan experienced. So, and certainly how disruptive it was to Pakistan. So those three wars, you can kind of see an escalating sequence of each of these countries attaining greater sophistication, greater conventional warfare capacity, and just the capacity to do a lot more damage to each other. And these wars become a lot more horrifying. I think this is
10 million refugees flee to India in the 1971 war.
Yeah, the 1965, thousands die in that war. 1971, tens of thousands die in that war. And if you include Bangladeshis, hundreds of thousands die in that war. Yeah, so things are escalating. I believe at some point, the exact chronology escapes me. I think India might have tested first in the 70s, and Pakistan didn't test openly until the 90s, but they may have had the capacity earlier.
I think the phrase is, no matter what it takes, we will eat grass, we will have a nuclear weapon, according to Pakistan.
And they did. And they did. And the fact that you've successfully gone 50 years without before 1971, these are massive wars. After 1971, I think so it was the 1970s, India develops the nuclear weapon. What you've got are incidents. A series of incidents and border skirmishes. Things had sort of been kept rather locked down. And I think this is one of the best cases that advocates of nuclear weapons have. This idea that at least they've both got nukes, so they don't go to a serious war anymore because they can't. I am not in that camp, Rory. I am, in fact, in the camp of nobody should have nuclear weapons, including the United States, because every single country that has these weapons is a possibility of these weapons being used. And as we go forward in time, as we measure in years and decades and centuries, each country that has a nuke makes it exponentially more likely that these weapons are going to be used. And I would submit that what happened between May 7th and May 10th is an indicator that actually the fact that folks have nuclear weapons is not providing security.
But Pakistan's nuclear bombs are quite small by modern standards, so that should cheer you up.
Oh, great. That's good. Just a mini Hiroshima. Of course, by modern standards, that's probably only 100 times bigger.
Oh, yeah, it's probably like a couple of Hiroshimas. I don't think they have hydrogen bombs.
Well, grand. I guess I'll be.
And they've reserved the right to fire first. I think that's their way to make up for the fact that they're smaller.
Great. So my understanding is that this conflict blew through a lot of the comfortable red lines that had been established for decades, frankly. A lot of the conflict, a lot of these incidents had taken place in Kashmir primarily, back and forth across the line of control in Kashmir. These conflicts apparently involved, planes fighting each other and both countries bombing military installations throughout both of the countries. Just a tremendous leap up the escalatory ladder. Suppose you kind of argument as well, but it only lasted 3 days, and they were able to be persuaded that it's a bad idea. And it's true that if they hadn't had nuclear weapons, I'd say the chances of there being an ongoing, very large scale conventional war at this point are would be a lot higher.
Well, something that's with this recent conflict is India suspended the 1960s Indus Water Treaty, which could be terrible for Pakistan.
Yes, thank you. That is a huge, huge issue, and a lot of that's another one of these big red lines that has been worked through. I think the 1960 Indus Water Treaty survived two full-on wars between India and Pakistan. It's a 1960 treaty, and 1965 and 1971 didn't dislodge it. But now India has decided to use this as a club against Pakistan, which
Basically,
is
nearly all of Pakistan's water comes from India in the Himalayas.
is it through Kashmir, perhaps indicating
Yeah,
why this
through
is so
exactly.
important.
So it's incredibly dry, and all of its farm basically relies on these rivers. So theoretically, India could just turn off the tap.
Which is an argument that's a pretty existential
Oh yeah, it's
problem.
horrific.
So should Pakistan threaten nuclear retaliation for that? I mean, that's an open question. So I talked about this in the live chat, but this conflict it just has caused me to lose a titanic amount of respect for both of these countries. I think it is humiliating that these countries are putting their populations at risk in this fashion, even though I know it is superficially popular among both populations.
Do you buy any credence in the idea that Modi set this up as a false flag because his opinion polls are not doing great, and nothing helps you better than a war?
I suppose anything's possible, but Pakistan is also the Pakistani government is also benefiting massively from this. And it is established as the Pakistani government denies responsibility for this particular action, but not even the Pakistani government can deny that they have historic relationships with terrorists. I mean, that is one of the weapons of weakness that Pakistan has traditionally used.
Well, they kind of see it as a fact, like it tries to level the playing field since they are at such a disadvantage. Having all these sort of disparate groups all over the place can cause a bit of mayhem to bring it a bit more level.
Exactly, it's a weapon of weakness, and it makes me. So I've lost respect for both Pakistan and India, but I've lost vastly more respect for India because I didn't have much respect for Pakistan in the first place. I mean, Pakistan is a sad country that has maintained a sort of the ghost of a military deterrent that is somewhat effective against its vastly larger, wealthier, more powerful neighbor at the cost of its democracy, at the cost of real economic development. Like, Pakistan is a basket case of a country with nuclear weapons that has sacrificed everything just to be able to do what happened between May 7th and 10th. And if it had gone on to May 20th, I believe that military component that they've sacrificed everything for would probably have been crushed. There's the contrast. Back in the 1990s, Musharraf had to do a coup to be in charge of Pakistan. There is an elected prime minister and president right now in Pakistan, but I haven't even bothered to really learn their names because everybody just acknowledges without him needing to do a coup or a more obvious coup. You can argue that Imran Khan being thrown out was a coup. Everyone just acknowledges that Asim Munir, the head of the Pakistani military, is the real guy in charge of Pakistan. It's not a question anymore.
So I've heard people sort of saying a lot of the time you could sort of see the Pakistani military as almost Pakistan itself. It is a very integral part of Pakistan.
Which is profoundly sad because it's so much is invested in this institution that isn't actually capable of really standing up to India.
But do you think if they hadn't, they would have been taken over by India by this point?
I don't know that they would have. It's hard to say because India is not as has been illustrated to some extent in this conflict. Like, India is not like a super belligerent military or militarily oriented place. India did successfully. I think the largest statue on the planet is built of Vallabhbhai Patel in the 1940s. They did successfully take over all of those sultanates and nawabs and what have you that had been set up by the British on Indian territory. But, Pakistan was successfully established as a separate country. I think that India, frankly, doesn't want any more Muslim majority territories. That's been part of the guiding ideology of India is we want fewer Muslims. Certainly now, but I think even back in the Nehru era, I think Nehru really wanted to be in charge of a unified British India, but he eventually conceded the point that that wasn't going to happen. And the current Indian government, they're gonna take over Karachi. I don't think they're actually interested in that.
Okay.
So it really is just kind of like a prestige thing. So Pakistan is long established, just kind of a sad place. India is the world's largest democracy. India has a guy in charge who's a wannabe strongman, and at the 2024 elections, he was humiliated. He retained enough power to continue as the prime minister, but it's like a coalition government. He's very hampered. I think you astutely pointed out earlier that, yeah, he definitely, I think it probably overstates it to imagine like a false flag thing, like he wanted this to happen, but he's absolutely benefiting from it immensely. But India is a democracy. India is the most populous country on the planet. India is like somewhere between the third and the fifth largest economy on the planet. Crucially, India is exhibiting some very serious economic growth, is making like some real progress.
And it's got an Apple factory now.
And it's got an Apple factory, indeed. The amount of respect that I've lost for India over this is a lot higher because I didn't have much respect for
What was it exactly that India did that you felt over-escalated this?
So in 2008, Rory, there was a horrific terrorist attack in Mumbai, much more directly.
166 killed?
Yeah, in multiples. And it wasn't like one big suicide bombing. It was like a highly trained paramilitary group of terrorists that I think spent 4 days rampaging across Mumbai, like popping up in different places, sort of reminiscent of that an antecedent of that Paris attack. That was so horrifying about a decade back. Directly linked, I think, much more directly linked to the Pakistani government and Pakistani-funded militants. And India was like, this is horrible. We demand an investigation. And that was it. That's what India should have done. That's what a non-cowardly, non-weak government does when faced by something like this. Instead, Modi has chosen to take orders from those terrorists who murdered those people in Pahalgam. And this is not the first time. Back in 2019, he also began to establish this new doctrine that if there's a terrorist attack, whether or not it can be connected to Pakistan, we're going to use that as an excuse to escalate a military situation. Obviously, this terror attack is disgusting, is to be condemned. It's not so obvious that Pakistan it was responsible for it. I think to some degree they probably were.
But yeah, there are a lot of terrorist groups they do support, so if they didn't directly order it, they are somewhat responsible.
Yeah, and I suppose Indian nationalists would say, well, yeah, we did the relaxed thing, Rob. We did in 2008, and it just keeps happening. And the thing is, it doesn't really. It happens very infrequently. It is sad and stupid and gross. And Pakistan should be pitied for being such a weak and crappy country that it has to indulge in this sort of thing. But what India does here is it actually it rewards the terrorists. It rewards Pakistan to the point where I think people are kind of angry that Trump is treating Pakistan and India as like sort of equal co-belligerents here. Well, India did that. India chose to take a nasty crime that was committed against them that should be incredibly humiliating to Pakistan and turn it into a like legit war. And that's what India did wrong here. India should treat a bunch of criminals doing some murders. And if there's nothing that illustrates this better than the U.S.'s experience after 9/11. And that's what Modi's doing. He's being very European. He's being very American. Despite all his assertions of Hindu supremacy and ancient civilization, he's being just as barbaric as George W. Bush. That's not, I mean, I can't say that, he can't do that because, this is the lesson that the United States has provided. This is the example we provide. But the idea that it's the right thing going forward, I think, is nuts. The fact that he's choosing to threaten nuclear war in perpetuity at the whims of a bunch of Pakistani-funded terrorists
Mm-hmm.
is insane, to my mind. So that is what India has done wrong. And as you know, he's just being a little George W. Bush, and that is unwise and causes me to lose respect for India.
What has Trump done in the middle of all this?
It's there's some dispute over that. I think that
Mm.
initially a lot of folks in the U.S. were gleefully talking about, oh, he's just trying to claim responsibility for this, or he's saying that he brought about a ceasefire, and then Pakistanis and the Indians are denying it, or what have you. But in the fullness of reporting, it does appear that Trump and his administration, not Trump personally, but I think Vance and Rubio may have played some part in establishing the ceasefire, and good. So Trump ended up announcing this ceasefire on May 10th. And thus far, 5 days later, it is held. He is, however, I think it does appear that some of his communication around it has outraged the Indians. So he may actually be hurting relations with India or what have you.
You can't see them getting too bad.
I mean, it's hard to envision. And it's also, again, it's hard to be sympathetic to India's complaints here. They are the ones who chose to
Escalate things.
Yeah, and chose to treat Pakistan as like a peer competitor they should be bombing, and
Mm-hmm.
Trump is acting accordingly.
How has China got involved, apart from, supplying weapons to Pakistan?
I know that Chinese diplomats were very excited to see that they had, helped to shoot down some French fighter jets, and are very interested in learning more about that process. I would assume that China, like absolutely everybody else, would really like this to stop.
Yeah. Oh, definitely.
And would really like to have India and Pakistan talking to each other. China's a lot closer to the potential clouds of fallout than we are. I mean, honestly, it's just terrifying, Rory, that these two
Could flare up at any time.
incredibly populous countries with incredibly rich histories, civilizations more ancient than we could imagine, just might just annihilate each other at any point. It's hard to be
Optimistic.
no, I mean, in the long term, I think anything's possible, but it's hard to minimize the threat
Yeah, the
here,
seriousness.
the seriousness of this. And I do think, I was on a date last night, and I was like, oh yeah, did you know that India and Pakistan almost went to war? And she was like, really?
Mm-hmm.
I had no idea. And she did not seem like an unintelligent person.
Mhm.
It's just simply that, as happened the last time around, I think a lot of this great power competition nonsense was launched during the first Trump administration because all of us were paying too much attention to Trump and not enough attention to everything else. So I think we're really seeing, even differently from 2019, or certainly from the 1990s, back when there were more established news organizations that were a little more interested in telling you things that you needed to know.
Mhm.
I think most of the news consuming public would have been paying a lot of attention to what was happening May 7th through 10th. But now, with just a few profit-driven, eyeballs-driven news institutions left, I mean, sure, New York Times wrote a bunch of articles on it, but it doesn't really seem to have impacted I guess this is the closest we've come to nuclear war, except for Ukraine, Russia,
Mhm.
U.S. Thing. And arguably, this is closer to nuclear war because the United States and Russia, thankfully, have not been directly exchanging fire at any point since 2022, or at least not openly. Yeah, this is probably the closest we've come to nuclear war since the Cold War, and it's just not really being talked about.
And one horrible thing about that, is because I talked about how Pakistan's missiles are much smaller, there's a fear that they'll use them in on a certain battlefield and it'll have an effect. And then it's almost like you've broken the taboo of nuclear weapons. So it's like, oh, that kind of worked out well. So it might be, they don't have enough to destroy the world, but India does. So it might kind of start a horrific process of normalizing them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is probably the most likely next use of a nuclear weapon by human beings against each other is probably India, Pakistan. So yeah, we should all probably know a little bit more about it, and I hope that this hour was helpful in that endeavor.
Well, thank you for your time, and we'll catch you next time.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.